So welcome everyone. Welcome to the next installment of our online talk series Behind the Scenes, Conversations on Empirical Platform Governance Research. My name is Christian Katzenbach. I'm one of the co-hosts of this series together with Paloma Viejo-Otero and Joao Megalés. So we are hosting this out of the University of Bremen and the University of Groningen. We've been doing this now for over a year, I think. The idea is to gather people to talk about the empirical research in platform governance. And besides this kind of special and shared theme, we would really like to encourage exchange in this field and in our community about the challenges and about the options and trajectories that we have been taking in this empirical work. Because we all know empirical work is always in a way challenging, but in this space, there might be particular challenges when it comes to data access, talking to organizations, and many other things. And that's what we are trying to encourage, an open and curious exchange about also maybe the failures and the problems we have been facing. And maybe there are also problems we haven't yet found solutions for. That's what we try to encourage. And today we are really happy to have Robert Gorwa with us. Paloma will probably introduce Robert in a minute. I'm only here to welcome and set the scene. And with that, I think I hand over.
Welcome, everybody. Today we are celebrating the session number 10th. We have been over a year, and I have the honor of introducing and facilitating Robert Gorwa presentation. Robert Gorwa is a postdoctoral researcher at the Berlin Social Science Center. He studies the politics of technology policymaking with a special interest in platform governance and emerging socio-technical regulatory arrangements in the digital economy. He received his doctorate from the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford, and currently also holds a non-resident fellowship at the Center for Democracy and Technology in DC, and at the Center for International Governance and Innovation in Waterloo. Robert is prolific in terms of publications, but today we're going to hear more about his latest book, especially the methods surrounding the interviews and the freedom of information at request that he conducted in order to finish a book that is titled The Politics of Platform Regulations, How Governments Shape Online Content Moderation. I would like to add some personal words, and is that I'm particularly fond that Robert is here today. I remember when his article, What is Platform Governance, came out in 2019. And I remember that at the time I was grappling with ideas of governance and governmentality. And something I absolutely loved was that Robert's work contributed to the clarity of mind. So I'm sure that his work has benefited to many of us in the same way. So particularly fond of this talk. So the title of the talk is Qualitative Methods for Regulatory Episodes, Examining Policy Development in the Context of Global Platform Regulation. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paloma, Joao, Christian, for the welcome. It's amazing to be here with you all. So maybe let me go right into the slide, which I think we are all here to see, which is some embarrassing photos of me when I started this project, before I even knew what Zoom was in 2016 or 2017. And what I thought I would do when starting to talk a little bit about this today was to talk about candidly some of the challenges I faced in this work, in this research, and also maybe talk about the ways in which my grand plans for a kind of in-depth, almost ethnography of policy change and platform governance inside of companies didn't pan out at all. So when I first started out, first as a master's student and then in 2017 as a PhD student, I really got interested in all of these things that are alluded to on this last slide. The architecture, design decisions, and affordances of major platforms, their bureaucratic systems of rulemaking, and the administrative infrastructures of policing and enforcement that we all know and love and have researched ourselves. And again, at the time, there was some work from pioneering researchers, some of whom are in this call, I think. But generally, the focus of this work was on the kind of legal scholars side of things, looking at the labor behind content moderation, and less, I guess, from a kind of institutionalist or bureaucratic perspective at how these policies were changing over time. So I was interested in understanding change in platform governance, the factors that were pushing firms to change their policies, to develop different policies, the kinds of processes of stakeholder consultation in which they had involved in these processes. And I was lucky enough to tag along on a interesting project. So at a brief moment in time after the US election, after Brexit, after what some have called the start of the techlash, there was a weird moment where I was riding along the coattails of some other people that managed to get pretty good access to some of the companies, in particular Facebook, to look at policy development kind of on the ground. So I was still a grad student. I got invited along to be part of this workshop in Menlo Park, where Facebook was starting to think about putting its kind of extended community guidelines online. And they were doing some consultation with academics and civil society as part of that process. So I'm sure many of you will remember, but pre-2018, we knew, for example, that hate speech was not permitted on Facebook, but we didn't have granularity about what exactly they considered to be hate speech, what the rules were more precisely, other than kind of bits and pieces that had been leaked by journalists. There were the Guardian files, these kinds of things. So, I had a pretty remarkable week where I was in California with this bigger team, and it really looked like some companies were willing and interested in talking to researchers for the first time. Kate Klonick had just, been doing her work. There were some other folks in Germany who were also in conversations about getting access to these policy forums that Facebook was organizing, through which they would, do it live and kind of organize input into how specific policies should be changed. And it was actually a bit crazy because, again, you couldn't tell to what extent this was just a show that was being put on or not. But nonetheless, we were getting, more insights into what things were looking like on the inside. And also, to me, as a, still very, very new grad student at this point, I was getting a bit of I guess jaw-dropping access to people like Monica Bickert, to people like Elliot Schrage, very senior people inside the company. So what I initially wanted to do, and I think this was part of my first PhD proposal, was to basically use this Facebook case study as a jumping off point to pull on the tradition of policy research that does kind of more institutional or bureaucratic ethnographies. So I had done some qualitative work for my master's, and I really wanted to be an ethnographer. And it really seemed like we had great contacts through this project, through the historian Timothy Garden Ash, who had been working on free speech and was a big name, and had good connections to some of the people at Facebook, to Sheryl Sandberg and other very senior people. So this was the moment at which I really kind of went down this path in a serious way. I think this was a few years, well, I guess this was a good year before I started writing that What is Platform Governance article. And this is when I really kind of got involved in this literature in a deep way. And I'm not going to talk too much about the book, but that is not what I ended up doing and what I ended up writing. And basically what I found was, as this very discrete project ended, as Facebook released its kind of extensive community guidelines and then was satisfied with the stakeholder outreach there, my access pretty much evaporated. I remember going back to some senior Facebook people, presenting them with this idea where, I was like, oh, maybe I can also do more interviews, or maybe even more of this kind of structured observation that I've been doing over the last couple weeks. And pretty much the answer was, yeah, well, no. And what do we get out of it was the kind of implicit underlying message, where if you don't have a senior, PI who's kind of behind the scenes, who's going to add status to the project. Also, to be fair to them, I was an unknown quantity. it wasn't going to happen. And as I made my peace with this, it took a little while, but that I think was the kind of juncture point which led me to really shift my perspective away from what companies were doing and more towards what government actors in this space were doing. And the logic behind that decision was actually a kind of methodological one. And for better or for worse, I figured that there would be more information available to what governments were doing. And also I might be able to get better access to public stakeholders, policymakers, but also people in civil society who have visibility into what governments are doing. So over time, the project and my PhD and eventually this book became more about also understanding change, but more about understanding change in platform regulation as the kind of overarching legal or policy context which shapes or seeks to shape what companies are doing in terms of their platform governance, in terms of their content moderation policies and decisions. And because, again, I have a background that is a bit weird in terms of having, I guess, both trained in kind of media and communications and internet study stuff, as well as political science and international relations and global regulation, I was really interested in understanding these kinds of changes in a comparative perspective, looking at the political factors that were shaping different types of platform regulation in different contexts, and also maybe trying to bring a bit of a comparative lens to play to look at different strategies that different governments were deploying in different jurisdictions. So again, without belaboring the point too much, everyone does research differently. Definitely people who have had the misfortune to go through a more or less traditional political science department for their PhD, as I did, also will have a specific way of doing research, and this is something that has informed a lot of the work I do. But I tried to think about this in a kind of flow from theory to research design to empirics. And it started with thinking about some core concepts and observations that I was interested in and making some hypotheses about them. Then saying, okay, we have these concepts, so how do we understand whether or not these things that I think might be happening are actually happening in the real world? And then finally, trying to come up with a strategy empirically to actually test that and collect and analyze data that could be used to maybe prove or disprove or make arguments for or against the theory that I've advanced. So on the theoretical side, in the book, I come up with this concept of platform regulation strategies. I was told by my editor that this has to be catchy and ideally should be alliterative too. So there's 3 C's: convince, collaborate, and contest, which roughly correspond to kind of formal binding law or regulation, something in the middle, which is more collaborative, co-regulatory, and the convincing, the persuasive kind of type, which is the softest, the most informal, more cajoling, more kind of carrots rather than sticks regulation that isn't binding. And the question here was, okay, so I have these different types of strategies, and I'm coming with an observation that different countries around the world are starting to intervene in the space of platform regulation. And again, we can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A. It's a massive policy area that spans a bunch of different areas. I focus on online content regulation, and even that is becoming a really complex debate with many sub-policy areas. But once we have that general area, how do we look at variation, and how do we think about, I guess, the political and institutional processes that lead to different strategies being chosen? So that was my main interest, and that has persisted as the main interest in the book. So then from a research design process, again, I think, this is an incredibly complex terrain, and we're looking at really messy social phenomena. And if I was inclined differently, you could try to do some kind of, so at first, actually, I did do this kind of policy mapping approach where I built on data that has been collected by people at the Stanford Center for Internet Society. There's this WillMap resource of intermediary liability law. So I did spend a good amount of time in my PhD basically trying to create an as robust as possible, as complete as possible kind of global data set of platform regulation. Theoretically, one could say, okay, let's look at some kind of quantitative indicators, correlate changes or specific features of these regulatory approaches with specific features of different countries, different economies, different regulatory capacities and institutional configurations. Again, very, very complex to do that, and that's not really my instinct as a researcher. I'm more qualitatively inclined. So instead, I opted for a kind of case study approach. And again, we can talk more about this, but this is something which obviously involves a lot of questions. Which unit of analysis? Are we focusing on companies like I initially thought? So looking at Facebook, looking at Google, do you want to look at different platforms? Or instead, are you looking at countries? Are you looking within countries to even look at different regulatory episodes within a single kind of polity like the EU, looking at the evolution of, for example, the platform regulation strategy of single actor over time? Again, do you try to have a comparative approach, picking out certain ones and looking internationally? These are all tough decisions, and you know, for better or for worse, there's a big literature, especially in the qualitative political science space, which is really digging into detail about the pros and cons of different trade-offs, most likely versus least likely case study designs, and all this stuff. From my point of view, again, because I think the specific stuff that I was looking at is so socially and politically complicated, I was happy enough to just have a kind of plausibility style approach where I was picking out different case studies that were relevant for various ways and for various reasons. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that too. But that's what I landed on. And then finally, what kind of data do we do or do we collect here? And I guess the major innovation that I tried to bring into this book was that I used freedom of information requests, and I started using them particularly intensively in the second half of my PhD. I also did a lot of interviews. Those of you who have been watching the series for a while, I'm sure have seen other talks where people talk about interviews in this space. And again, I think there's a lot more that we can talk about there. This question of how do you get actually reliable and often politically sensitive and potentially kind of, yeah, maybe not damning, but problematic information that can make certain actors look bad. People are trying to present themselves in a certain light. There's classic questions of access, especially to industry at play here. And these are all the kinds of things that I grappled with. And there's a long methods appendix in my book, actually. I'll put the link in the chat later if my Zoom doesn't crash. And I hope some of you can take a look at that. But what I wanted to talk about today, and I'm cognizant that time is running because of my technical issues in particular, but I want to talk a little bit more about the freedom of information request, just because I think that's kind of the most interesting and most unique thing that I did. But just for a bit brief context, you know, I did a lot of interviews, so I ended up doing 3 major case studies. One was the EU and Germany and the process that led up to the formulation of the NetzDG, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Some of you might not be as familiar with the fact that it started as a more kind of collaborative, informal co-regulatory initiative in 2015. So that was the first case study I researched, and I did a lot of interviews with people involved in those debates in the German government, as well as in the EU. That's a chapter which I've published previously in telecommunications policy, but it was really fun. Because I was getting into some of the institutional conflicts that were happening, not just within the German government and between the German government and civil society and industry, when people were really mad about the NetzDG, thought it was super problematic from a human rights standpoint, was going to do overblocking, all these things, but also in terms of conflicts between the German government and the EU Commission, which was in most cases, as I argue, extremely opposed to this law and actually had various institutional tools which they could have used but didn't use to prevent the law from going into effect. So happy to talk about that. That's also all in the book. But that's just one example. So I think in that case study, I did about 25 interviews, and I did about 25 interviews for the 2 other case studies. The other case studies were an analysis of the responses, the diverging responses in Australia and New Zealand to the Christchurch shooting, and then also a case study of the US and some kind of more recent developments there, especially at the state level. And I can talk a little bit more about the case selection and how I ended up researching those 3 specific countries in the Q&A. But what I had the most fun with was using freedom of information requests, which basically are, I think, a kind of underutilized tool for trying to get data from governments on a whole range of policy issue areas, but especially in the platform domain. And there's a small literature on this in the policy study space. And there are some researchers who basically have been using this for example, law enforcement or the criminal justice system, and have argued basically that governments are textual creatures. So much of what policymakers do, what bureaucrats do, is through producing and editing text, memos, emails, presentations, slides, so other things. And unless these actors are being very careful, theoretically, in certain contexts, especially kind of high income democratic contexts where countries which have access to information or freedom of information law, theoretically, a lot of this is potentially accessible to us as researchers. And there's a few interesting things here. One of them is that a lot of these documents are not just potentially interesting, but they can tell us kind of I guess, revealed preferences in a way that you might not be able to get through other methods like qualitative interviews, because theoretically many of these documents weren't at the time of consumption intended for public consumption. And then the second thing I think is interesting here is that due to the tough work of our colleagues in civil society, especially organizations that work on freedom of information and transparency and open government, it's kind of it's easier and better to make these kinds of freedom of information requests, I think, than ever before. So there is a backend infrastructure called Avatelli, and I don't know exactly who created it and funded it. It was a network of European NGOs, I think. But Avatelli creates a kind of freedom of information platform that looks like this. And it allows civil society organizations in many countries to basically create their national variations of this platform. So with the exception of the US, all the countries that I were looking at had some type of platform like this, which allows you not just to publicly archive your requests, but it also allows you to search any other requests that have been made by others using this platform. So if, for example, some of you were to go on to asktheeu.eu, which is the platform for all of the European Union's various institutions, there's a huge range of materials that you can easily access just by searching keywords like Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act. And there are many researchers, including me, but also many journalists, who have been actively FOIA-ing for their investigations different documents from different parts of the European Commission, for example. And what's really nice is all of these documents are available for you to use. Again, we can talk about limitations. A lot of them are heavily redacted. They often don't want to give you a lot of the stuff, especially the most controversial and kind of spicy and most interesting stuff. But nonetheless, it's a potentially fruitful source of data, in my opinion. So just to give you, 5 minutes maybe before I wrap up, and I'm sorry again for the technical difficulties, a little bit of context into what I did in one of these case studies. So I was interested in the aftermath of the Christchurch mosque shooting that happened in 2019. And I was interested in the fact that Australia and New Zealand, which are not just generally kind of socially, economically, politically closely interlinked neighboring countries, they were also actually interlinked by this event, by the fact that the Christchurch shooter was an Australian citizen living in New Zealand. And both countries came out quite explicitly, or the leaders of both countries came out quite firmly after the attack, basically blaming it on the ability that this could be live streamed by Facebook and other social media platforms, and also made quite clearly the argument that they believed, due to various reasons, that the perpetrator of this attack, who was a white supremacist kind of ideologue, was online radicalized. on online forums and potentially also social media platforms. So what was interesting for me is that these two closely interlinked countries responded to the same kind of shock crisis event with completely different regulatory strategies. And there were maybe some interesting variations and kind of paths not taken that could have happened. So Australia, Australia initially pondered a kind of informal, voluntary approach. They brought major companies to the table in Brisbane for this kind of informal summit, where they agreed to hash out a code of conduct that was going to govern violent extremist material and create some kind of response protocols and other measures that would potentially be implemented by companies and help impact how they dealt with far-right and other kind of violent extremist content. In New Zealand, they had the kind of opposite initial tack where they said, actually, we want to act really rapidly and really forcefully through binding regulation, sanction the companies, and basically reform intermediary liability in New Zealand. And the kind of opposite happened where the two leaders and the two governments flip-flopped, changed their positions. So very rapidly, as I show in my chapter in the book, Australia changed its tack and in a last-minute kind of move before a general election that was happening just a couple of weeks later, after telling the companies that they were going to do this code of conduct, they instead decided to draft a law very rapidly and force it through Parliament. It was called the Abhorrent Violent Material Act, or AVM Act. Evelyn Douek and others have written quite well about it and what is in it. But basically, it was a kind of punitive measure that was intended to sanction companies. There was some flashy language in there about CEOs potentially being imprisoned if they set foot in Australia and fell afoul of some of the provisions of the act. It was a kind of, speak loudly, shake a big stick approach to platform regulation and intermediary liability. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, they did the kind of opposite, where they ended up, instead of doing the kind of almost more Australian tack that was initially signaled, they changed gears and they moved to internationally kind of multi-stakeholder collaborative agreement, which worked with partnerships with industry, especially Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon, to develop something called the Christchurch Call, which actually arguably had a lot of maybe even bigger long-stream effects, because it led to the reconfiguration of something called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism and the creation, I guess, basically of a or not creation, but the adaptation of that institution, which previously existed, into a real international institution that had legal status and had to do stuff. Okay, so sorry, that was a bit long. These are kind of complex things, but that's what I was interested in. So what did I do? So I started by just identifying quickly the key actors at play. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in New Zealand, the Attorney General in Australia that developed the new law, the E-Safety Commission in Australia. It's very interesting, but Australia has had a digital safety / online harms regulator for a long time. They're relatively unique in the international context for this. They were also involved in the development of this policy. I then went on the FOIA platforms in both countries and searched them to see if anyone had made previous document requests that might be interesting for me using just general keywords. And then I came up with a bit of a FOIA strategy. So I made requests to the Attorney General as well as to the E-Safety Commissioner in Australia. And then New Zealand has a law where actually only New Zealand citizens are allowed to use are allowed to make FOIAs, while in Australia, anyone is allowed to make FOIAs. So I had, I mean, again, I don't know how legit this is, but I had a colleague who is from New Zealand make the request for me publicly on the FYI platform, where any responses would then be publicly archived and I could also access them. And then what happens? Then you wait. So here already, I've kind of teased one of the requests that I made on the Right to Know platform in 2020 about the Abhorrent Violent Material Act. This is more of the text. So there's a lot of debate, and there's been some kind of helpful discussion about this in journalistic circles, the investigative reporters who do FOIAs right away. I actually, was lucky enough to meet with some of them, the Netzpolitik reporters in Germany, for example, when I moved here, and they coached me a little bit on how best to do this. There's different strategies, which range from using very, very targeted requests when you have specific materials that you want to get, or even using targeted requests to verify that certain documents, which you've, for example, heard rumors about, that they might not exist or that they actually exist, even if you don't get them. Versus on the other end of the spectrum, doing these very broad kind of exploratory requests where you just try to kind of hunt and just see what they will give you. And yeah, so that's what I did here. I requested a broad range of documents, basically all policymaking and administrative documents relating to the adoption of the AVM Act. And I specifically also was interested in engagement with civil society and industry in the follow-up to the legislation being passed. And I was hoping to go out of this presentation and flick through some of these documents. I'll put the link in the chat. They're all publicly available. But I don't think I'll test Zoom now, so I won't do that. But here's a snapshot of some of the things I got. And to me, again, I don't know. I mean, I just found this whole process incredibly interesting. There is a bit of a policy of negotiation that happens with the government agencies. So this is also something that's reflected in the qualitative literature on FOIAs, where they really call this a process of data production rather than just collection, because it's really shaped in your engagement with the actors who are giving you FOIA. And in Australia, actually, the e-safety commissioner wanted to call me, not the e-safety commissioner herself, but staff at the e-safety commissioner, to try to figure out the scope of the request, figure out what they wanted to give me. And in the end, for example, from the Attorney General, I got something like 400 pages of documents, which just massively varied in their different scope. Everything from kind of early track changes versions of the bill from Word, which was kind of interesting, to internal risk assessments, internal kind of Prime Minister's office impact assessments, and kind of strategy documents, like this one on the left, which was talking about the political context and whether or not they were going to get other parties in the government to be able to support this, and if so, how. Two kind of broader strategy documents about their consultation. And again, I just thought, I mean, you know, this is something that I got out of interviews with industry, but the AVM Act was basically written over a single weekend and was passed in this was maybe the fastest platform regulation initiative start to finish that has ever happened. You know, having been in the UK in 2016 when the online harms consultation was starting and they had a green paper, and seeing that, you know, that just kind of got over the finish line this year or the late last year, it's remarkable that they were able to do this intervention in basically like a week. So as industry told me, civil society told me, they were not able to mobilize in time. And they even state internally, government says that they have not been able to consult industry stakeholders. These kinds of things, at least to me, were kind of interesting. So how did this help my research in terms of FOIA? And this is, I guess, kind of my pitch. I'm happy to also talk more candidly about the pros and cons and limitations of this kind of approach. But at least for me, I use FOIAs in all of my case studies. In the US case study, they were the least successful for various reasons that we can get at. But it turns out, you know, like red state AGs in Texas and Florida aren't super amenable to being FOIA'd and basically want you to sue them for documents, which I was not able to do, also not being in the US. But in the other chapters in Australia, New Zealand, in the EU, Germany, I really use FOIAs, and I drew on them a lot. And they're really a core part of the type of very micro level stories that I'm telling about how these policies built and evolved over time in all of my chapters. So I really helped them, you know, this really helped me to showcase and reconstruct, I guess, the timeline of different regulatory episodes. So in this case, show the timeline between the attack, the initial government response, to the kind of evolution to what was like finally chosen at the end. It helped me get a better picture of what the institutional conversation was at the time. So remembering that I was doing interviews I guess about 2 years after this had all happened. It's not always easy for stakeholders, even if you're able to get access to the right people, to remember accurately dates and think about exactly how things happened in what order, especially if you're really interested in this nitty-gritty stuff. So it's really interesting to kind of get that internal perspective and also get some kind of raw internal discussion of some of the challenges that policymakers saw. So, for example, in the case of Australia, FOIA documents, there was policy advice and email chains between people from the e-safety commissioner, who are real kind of domain experts, with the attorney general saying, hey, this is the limits of what we can do. This is what we can and shouldn't do legally. We have this free trade agreement, which technically this approach that you're thinking about would be maybe in violation of, because it has some limits on intellectual property and kind of e-commerce barriers to trade, which the AVM Act arguably could be. These kinds of things I think were really interesting. You can also, I think, get a little bit of a better idea for policy change internally, especially if they give you drafts and earlier things. Again, they're not giving me, at least in this case, they didn't give me every single version of the Word file of, for example, the final bill text, but they did give me an early version, which then I could compare and contrast to the kind of final version, as well as final versions of speeches and other kinds of interesting documents that, again, if you're a nerd on this kind of stuff and you're trying to really get a good idea as to what is going on, I think it's super helpful. So yeah, and then maybe finally, it helped me also triangulate my interviews. So this was one problem that I had, was basically that in Australia and New Zealand, so I was researching a lot of this during the pandemic, especially that chapter, and I wasn't able to travel. And it was just really difficult for me to get access to the kinds of policymakers that I wanted in Australia, particularly. Somehow in New Zealand, I was able to get amazing access through some networks, and I was able to interview the main person who was in charge of the Christchurch call, who was a senior diplomat who was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But in Australia, I was really struggling. I got good industry interviews, I got some good civil society interviews through contacts there, but I wasn't really able to get MPs and people in the commission. I talked to eSafety, I think, and a few people, but not really to the extent that I wanted. So this is extra data that can kind of help you, cover your tracks maybe a little bit, and also triangulate some information that you've gotten in your interviews. Okay, so that was a lot, and I'm sorry again for the disjointed start. That's just a bit of a background into, I guess, a behind the scenes into some of the work that went into this book. I really hope that some of you will check it out. It is open access now at this. I'll drop the link in the chat. And the print version is coming out in the next 2 weeks. And yeah, I'm just really excited and curious to hear what you all think about it. It's by far my biggest project. It's by far, my toughest and kind of most ambitious project. And yeah, I'm just really, really glad to be here and have the chance to talk about it with you all. And I'm keen to hear your thoughts on all of this craziness that I've been doing in my weird rabbit hole for the last 7 years.